Good morning, church family. This is Pastor Kevin, and I'm excited that you are joining us for worship and the ministry of the Word this morning. If you have your Bible with you, I invite you to open up to the Gospel of Luke, chapter 20. We're going to begin today in verse 9 and read through and work our way through verse 20. So, chapter 20, verses 9 through 20. If you haven't done so already, please take a moment and read those verses out loud. You can pause the video and then come back and hit play afterwards. All right, welcome back. You guys ready to dive in? I hope you're excited. This is the last full parable we have in Luke's gospel. And so it is very much a climactic parable in Luke's gospel. And it sets the foundation for the rapid succession of the rest of Jesus being moved into the narratives that surround his arrest and trial and crucifixion and resurrection and the aftermath of all of that. And so Luke is very much reaching a climactic head in this parable, and then also laying the foundation for everything that's going to come in the chapters that follow. And so we are going to begin here in verse 9. And let's remember that we are picking up exactly from where we left off last week. Last week we saw the authority of Jesus questioned, challenged. And the religious elite and the political elite, the Jewish leadership of their day, wanted to know what gave Jesus the right to clean out the temple, as he had just done at the end of chapter 19, what gives him the right to receive the praise, even worship of Israel. Why was he letting them sing songs about his kingship as he rode the young colt of a donkey, the foal of a donkey, into Jerusalem? And of course, they laid a trap that never sprung, as it always never works out for Jesus' enemies. And in this case, Jesus turned the tables on them. He turned those tables very effectively. I invite you to listen, watch last week's sermon. But this week, we're moving in continuation from that. So they're questioning his authority, and Jesus is under no obligation to explain his authority, where it comes from, why he has it, and how he wields it. But it is immediately in the aftermath of that conversation that this conversation comes. And so Jesus just jumps right into the parable. We see here in verse 9 that he began to tell the people this parable. And the parable begins, a man planted a vineyard and let it out to tenants and went into another country for a long while. And so what's being established here is that there is an owner of a vineyard, and that he has actually planted and established the vineyard and then rented this land, the vineyard, and the fruit of that vineyard out to tenant farmers. And so we're going to find out what these tenants are like in a little bit. But this is the backdrop, that there's an owner, that there's a vineyard, and that there are these tenants who have an obligation to pay for the land that they're using, and to pay a portion of the fruit that they're growing there. And so the expectation here is that they are producing enough grapes that can make wine, and that a portion of that wine will be paid annually or after the harvest and the fermenting period is complete. When the wine is ready for transport, that wine would then be picked up by a servant of the master who's away in a far country, and the fruit of his labor in giving them the use of the land, their labor, his land, will be carted to them and carted from them to him, and he'll receive it as payment for the use of that land, the use of his vineyard. And so one of the things we notice right away in this parable is that it will be not just a parable, but an allegorical parable. And I don't have time today to go into all the details on that, but Jesus is going to be teaching a series of lessons, a series of complex thoughts that he's going to be able to communicate in this super simple, super obvious parable. And yet, the allegory comes in because each character in this story is going to represent something very tangible, something very specific. So let's jump into this a little bit. I'm going to give you the handy notes up front before we work our way through. So if you want to write these down, you can. But God is being represented in this parable by the man who owns and plants the vineyard. So the owner in this parable of the vineyard is representing God. Second, the people of Israel as a nation, or kind of the privileged status they have as the chosen people, is going to be represented by the vineyard itself. Now, I know that a vineyard is not a person, but in this case, the vineyard does play the role of a character in this story in its allegorical sense. And so the people of Israel will be represented by the vineyard. And we'll get into more about that in a moment. Number 3, the spiritual and political leaders in Israel will be represented by the tenants, by the renters of the vineyard in that land. And so, and again, we'll get into more about them in a moment. The Old Testament prophets, so our beloved Moses and Elijah and Elisha and Jeremiah and Ezekiel and all these kinds of guys are being represented by the servants that the master sends to collect the growth payment. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. And so I want you to see these characters so that you can get a sense of what's being represented as we go through this. So again, God is represented by the man who owns and plants the vineyard. The people of Israel are being represented by the vineyard itself. And this is actually an image that you'll find in many occasions in the Old Testament. You'll see it often in the prophets, but you can even see it in the Psalms. So pay careful attention here to Psalm chapter 80, or Psalm 80, verse 8. The psalmist records this: "You brought a vine out of Egypt. You drove out the nations and planted it." That seems very clearly an image of Israel as a people group, being referenced here as a vine, as a vineyard. So you brought the vine out of Egypt, you drove out the nations, in other words, you tilled the soil, you cleared the land, and you planted the vine in such a way that it grew into a whole vineyard. And so you'll see this in Jeremiah, you'll see it in other prophets, but most notably, we'll get to in a little bit, you'll see it in Isaiah chapter 5. So if somebody wants to stick a finger in Isaiah chapter 5, we'll get there in a little bit. So we have the renters, these tenants, and you're going to find out that they are very wicked in just a little bit. So if I refer to them as the wicked tenants, you know who we're talking about. So the owner is in a faraway place. The time came, he sends a servant to the tenants that they would give him some of the fruit of the vineyard. So the owner sends his emissary, a servant, and in the Old Testament, you'll see on occasion that you can see it in Zechariah's prophecy, for example. The book of Zechariah will speak of the prophets being called servants of God. My servant, the prophet so-and-so. That's the idea. So the servant is sent at the right time, but the tenants choose to beat him and send him away empty-handed. Is that the right thing to do? Of course not. Of course that's not the right thing to do. They owe the demand of fruit, in this case wine, which is the fermented fruit of these vines, to the owner. So when the owner sends his servant, the servant should be received well, cared for, stay the night, have a meal. We'll load you up in the morning and we'll send you out comfortably on your way. But that's not what happens. These are wicked tenants. And so they beat the servant, send him away. And in fact, he comes back empty-handed. And so the master, the owner of the field, sends another servant. But we read in verse 11 that they also beat and treated him shamefully. So they don't just beat him, they add to that shameful treatment. And again, same result, they send him away empty-handed. So what's the owner going to do? Well, he's going to send a third servant. He sends yet a third servant. And this one also they wounded and cast out. So there is a sense of escalation here, I think, but also the pattern is being established. Whoever comes in the name of the owner of the vineyard is going to be mistreated and sent away. He will not be received. He will not be welcomed. He will not be treated in the accord with which he deserves to be treated as the servant of the master. So then what's the owner going to do? Is he going to say, I didn't care about that land anyway? No. Is he going to say, well, eventually I'll get better tenants? Well, how would that happen? Don't you have to get rid of the tenants that you have now in order to get better tenants? Well, certainly you do. So the owner, according to this parable that Jesus is telling, has a difficult choice to make in verse 13. So here we go, verse 13. The owner of the vineyard says, "What shall I do?" What shall I do? And then he comes to a conclusion. He makes his decision. He says, I will send my beloved son. Perhaps they will respect him. You think they're going to respect him? I mean, they were only bondservants who came before. This is actually the heir of the land. This is the son of the father who owns the property. Maybe they'll respect him. Well, before we answer that question, let's establish a couple of things. We've already established that the vineyard represents the people of Israel. Yes? Psalm 80 verse 8 really helped us with that. The spiritual and political leaders of Israel in Jesus' day are the ones being represented by these wicked tenants. For who else is charged with the care of the vineyard? Who is it? Whose job is it to see to the production of fruit fit for the vats to be fermented into the wine? In other words, who's responsible for producing spiritual fruit in Israel? If Israel's the vine, then who are the caretakers of that vine? In other words, who's responsible for the spiritual growth and the protection of God's people? Wouldn't it be the elders and the scribes and the Pharisees, the priests, these same leaders that we're told in Luke 19:47 are seeking to destroy Jesus? Aren't those the ones who have the responsibility to care for God's people in such a way that they produce fruit Fruit in keeping with repentance, according to John the Baptist? See, here's the challenge for us. We know this story. We know how this ends, but we need to enter into this moment where Jesus is standing in the temple. This is God's temple, in his holy city. And he is saying to the leadership of Israel that you are wicked tenants. He's challenging them, not in whether they have authority, but in how they are using the authority that ultimately God gave them. They, not he, have been given authority, and they are being called to account for their care, or lack thereof, in this case, abuse of God's people. And we're going to see that grow thematically in the next couple of chapters in Luke's gospel. But let's get to the Old Testament prophets. See, they are being represented by these servants, these three servants, the servant in verse 10, the servant in verse 11, the servant in verse 12, that are being sent to collect what God has owed, which would be, joyful obedience, right? They're sent as God's ambassadors. They speak with the authority of the one who sent them. For the sake of brevity, I'm going to let the martyr of the early church, Stephen, tell you about the history in Israel of the prophets. Okay, so for the sake of brevity, we're going to let Stephen summarize this for us. As Stephen is on the verge of being martyred by the same leadership and leaders who have caused Jesus's death, his crucifixion, in a man's sense. Obviously, this is the divine plan of God, or he would never have sent his son, because both the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit as well all know what is coming. They've chosen this path. But also, these men are responsible for what they've done. So here's Stephen speaking to this council of leaders. And he says to them, which of the prophets did your fathers not persecute? And they killed those who announced beforehand the coming of the righteous one, whom you have now betrayed and murdered. This is Stephen speaking in Acts chapter 7, verse 52. Acts 7:52. Which of the prophets did your fathers not persecute? And they killed those who announced beforehand the coming of the righteous one, whom you have now betrayed and murdered. See, that's the key here. The servants have been sent, and they've been mistreated. And Stephen's summary is that throughout the Old Testament, the people of God keep rejecting these servants that God is sending. And the most important emissary that will ever be sent is the beloved Son. So if we look at this parable, we see verse 13 come to life. The Father chooses, the owner of the vineyard chooses to send his beloved Son. Are you getting this? The Father sends his beloved Son. This is the gospel. This is a clear allegory of who the beloved Son is. Who's the beloved Son? At Jesus' baptism, God said, "This is my Son." At the Mount of Transfiguration, Peter, James, John, they heard the voice from the cloud declare authoritatively that this is the beloved Son. Jesus is the Son of God. the divine and human Son, the Son of God and the Son of Man. He is the Son of the Father, the Son of the owner of the vineyard in this parable. And this is where all of us want to interrupt the parable. Because we know this story and we want to scream at the top of our lungs. Desperately, we want to say, no, don't send your son. If they mistreated your servants, what do you think they're going to do to your son? You think they're going to go, oh, well, I guess he means business. He sent the son. No, they're going to think you're dead and that the son is coming to collect. And so they're going to kill him, thinking that they can just take ownership of the land and keep it. Keep their authority, keep their power, and keep all the fruit of the vineyard for themselves. You see how wicked this is? There's no sense of justice here. There's no sense of honor here. There's no sense of righteous living here. And so the Father says, I will send my beloved Son. Guys, this is the heart of the parable. This is the thing that it's teaching most. Can we draw an understanding of God's patience from his long suffering and in being far away for a long time? Like, yes, we can talk about God's patience. Can we talk about the certainty of persecution by the enemies of God as we look at the servants and how they were treated? Like, yes, we can draw all of these other lessons and images, sure. But the center of this, the heart of this parable, and the reason it's being presented right here, right now, in the temple of God, in the city of God, by the righteous Son of God, is that we would see him as the beloved Son of the owner, sent to collect what is owed. It's the Father's choice to send his beloved Son, and it will have a cost, and that cost will be paid in, it'll be paid in blood. Listen to how the parable continues. Verse 14, but the tenants saw him, and they said to themselves, this is the heir. Let's kill him. Let's kill him, so that the inheritance may be ours. So they threw him out of the vineyard, and they killed him. Let me put this in slightly different language. They dragged him outside, out of town, and they killed him. That's going to happen to Jesus before the week finishes. He's going to be bound and dragged, carrying his cross. Can't even carry his cross the whole way. Somebody else has to pick it up and carry it for him, right? Simon of Cyrene is going to pick it up and carry it up the hill, because he can't even make it up the hill. Outside the city, they've beaten him so badly. And then they're going to crucify him, overlooking the city. What do you think the owner's going to do? He sent servant number 1, and he was patient. He sent servant number 2, and he was patient. He sent servant number 3, and he was patient. He sends his Son, his beloved Son. You don't think Jesus knows who he is? He knows he's the beloved Son of God. He sends his beloved Son. You think payment won't be demanded? You think God has no sense of justice? No, no. Jesus is going to make very clear that God will have justice. Every ounce of their debt will be paid for by them forever. Forever. What's the owner of the vineyard going to come and do to them? Jesus asks at the end of verse 15. In verse 16, he answers, he will come and destroy those tenants and give the vineyard to others. And when they heard this, the leaders, the audience in the temple courts scream out, surely not. Surely not. Surely this is not what can happen. Because here's the thing that every Hebrew knows that we have to be told. And that's that they know that the vineyard represents Israel as the chosen people of God. And the leadership of the vineyard would be the scribes and the elders and the Pharisees. It would be the leaders and priests, the whole structured system of governance. And Jesus is saying, no, God is going to come, destroy them, and take away their authority and power and give it to someone else. Why does every Hebrew ear know that? Well, the answer comes in Isaiah 5. So if you want to turn with me to Isaiah chapter 5, and we're going to look at verse 1 and then verse 7, but you have to understand that verses 1 through 7 are kind of this sad love song that's being sung. It's a love song and a lament kind of wrapped together. So listen to the opening of this love song. The author actually, here's Isaiah in his book, and he's actually going to use the term love song. Listen, Isaiah 5, verse 1. Let me sing for my beloved my love song concerning his vineyard. My beloved had a vineyard on a very fertile hill. You get this? Okay, well then you go through the song, and I don't have time to do that today, but you can study it sometime this week on your own. I think it'll be rewarding. But then you get to the end of this section in verse 7. And here's the prophet Isaiah clarifying everything that's happening in this moment. And it's helpful for us too. For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts, you ready? The vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel. And the men of Judah are his pleasant planting. And he looked for justice, but behold, bloodshed. He looked for righteousness, but behold, an outcry. In other words, what's happening here is that as you go through this sad love song of justice being missing and destruction coming, you begin to understand that Israel is the vineyard. And in fact, Israel loved the imagery of being a vine-connected vineyard so much that it was an icon to them. It was actually found in the temple architecture. So when you would go into the temple, there was whole areas that were decorated, bejeweled, literally, with smelted gold and precious metals and precious jewels, and they would over time add to and grow this vine imagery in the architecture of the temple. In fact, it would be like going to North Carolina Chapel Hill and not understanding what the color powder blue represents. Like, it represents the school. Everything is powder blue. Or if you go to Duke, you get that dark navy blue, right? And there's a huge rivalry between those two colleges and universities. So you know kind of who you're identified as or who you're loyal to based on the simple color imagery of dark blue versus, powder blue. That Carolina powder blue. I mean, I can't even describe the color without saying Carolina in it. You know what I'm talking about? Carolina blue. So you get this loyalty and this passion interconnected to this image. For them, it's these colors and the rivalry, usually in basketball, kind of most notably, but it's also happening for Israel. So every Jew knows that if you're going to start talking about vines and vineyards and grapes and good grapes as opposed to bad grapes, or grapes that only produce wild grapes instead of good sturdy grapes, like, you get this sense that you're talking about Israel and you're talking about the leadership of Israel who's charged with the management, the oversight, the care of the vineyard. So all these Jewish leaders hear this parable pass through the lips of Jesus, and they're incensed, they're angry, they're passionately yelling, "Surely not." Don't underestimate the forcefulness of that exclamation point in your Bible. Why is their reaction so strong? Because the faraway Father is obviously going to rain down some justice, isn't he? Like, we read this parable and we think, what are they surprised about? They're surprised, even angered at the notion that somebody else can take their spot. But that's exactly what happens. The Sanhedrin is going to be overthrown. The temple's going to be surrounded by the General Titus and the Roman army, and it's all going to come crumbling down as they besiege the city. This is part of what Jesus was lamenting on the way in. Remember, it's not just the triumphant entry, it's also the tearful entry. Part of the reason Jesus is weeping over Jerusalem is because he knows this city's never going to look the same. In the coming decades, it will be overthrown. He also knows that Israel will be, as the leaders of the people of God, replaced by the disciples turned apostles. And eventually, when the perpetual offices of elders and deacons take hold, then they're not even going to have apostles anymore. So he knows that there's going to be this overlap of transition, this overlap of transitioning authority from the priests and the Levites, the Sanhedrin, the ruling councils, the Pharisees. All of that structure is going to quickly pass away in the decades in front of them. And the church is going to be built and grow no longer as one ethnic Israel, but rather as Israel scattered among the nations, the church in the nations all around the globe, as it was always promised to be. This is not some second plan that Jesus is developing on the fly. This was the eternal plan of redemption unfolding in their midst. But this is why they're so upset. They're so upset because it never occurred to them that as they abuse the people of God and misuse and abuse the power God gave them, that he could ever take it from them, that he would ever purpose to do that. They're the chosen people after all. Yes, for that season, they are. And yet, the coming of the beloved Son to be taken outside the city and die is the basis of saving faith for all the saints of old in the Old Testament and the saints of new from the start of the new covenant on. It's one covenant of grace, merited by the Son, applied despite what we deserve to the people of God. And so here's Jesus as he's teaching this parable. They're crying out in objection. And then we hear in verse 17, Luke records that Jesus looked directly at the wicked servants that are represented in this parable. He looks directly at the Jewish leadership, and he says to them this. He says, what then is written? What then is this that is written? In other words, well, then why does the Old Testament say this? And then he quotes, the stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone, or the keystone, or the capstone. And of course, this is a quote from Psalm 118. Now, if Psalm 118 jogs your memory a little bit, yes, that is the psalm, the ancient song, that the people of Israel had just been singing to Jesus just days before. As Jesus is entering Jerusalem, as he's approaching Jerusalem, and they're throwing down palm branches and laying their cloaks down for him to ride on, as he's riding on the donkey, that young colt, as he's riding up on the road of ascension towards Jerusalem, towards the temple. This is the psalm that they are singing to him. They're singing to him based on the verses that follow right after this quote. This is verse 22. Psalm 118, verse 22. The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. Why does he quote this? He quotes this to say to them, what are you surprised about? Didn't you know that you had already rejected me? And yet, I'm the cornerstone of it all. I'm the only thing that can align the true temple of God, which is not made with human hands. God's not served by human hands as if he needed anything. He himself gives all men life and breath and everything else. That's what the Apostle Paul says up on Mars Hill, as he quotes it to the Areopagus in Acts 17, verse 25. So he quotes that, looking at them. Can you imagine the death stare that he's giving them? And he says these words in verse 18. Everyone who falls on that stone will be broken to pieces. And when it falls on anyone, it will crush him. Jesus is looking at the very men who will take his life by their politics, by their passion, and he's saying to them, do not trip over me. Do not be found underneath the weight of me as a crushing rock, right? You get these two verbs. In verse 18, you get broken and you get crushed. And these two give us a sense of both now, broken now, don't trip over me now, and later, that there will be a coming judgment. There will be a day when the vine owner, the owner of the land that the vineyard is on, is going to come in judgment and destroy you. You're seeking to destroy the Son, but you're working out the plan of redemption that will be your destruction. Don't trip over me. Don't be found under the weight of God's judgment. It will crush you. Instead, flee the coming wrath. And then we're told in verse 19, the scribes and the chief priests sought to lay hands on him. That's so gently said. They want to grab him and they want to drag him outside the city, and they soon get to do that. But I want you to see how connected all of these things are. This 19 and 20 and what's going to come and the rest of 20, 21, 22, it's all connected. The scribes are trying to lay hands on him, at that very hour, right? He just looked them dead in the eye and said, judgment is coming. So why don't they grab him right then? They want to kill him. They've wanted to kill him for so long now. He's already promised that his death is coming. He said that in Luke's gospel already. And then, why do they want to kill him? Why do they want to kill him? Verse 19 gives us the answer. They want to kill him because, they're very quick-witted right here, because they perceived that he told this parable against them. Wow, quick on the uptake, huh? Like, seriously? Like, he's looking at you. He's warning you. And they wake up and go, wait, do you mean that parable's about us? No. All right, we're going to kill him. So they don't. Why? Because they fear the people. They're still cowards. Well, they'll work the system and it'll come to a head soon enough. But then we get verse 20. So they want to lay hands on him. They realize that he told the parable about them. Duh. And then they watch him. They send spies to infiltrate, pretending to be sincere, that they might catch him in something he said. Why? So that they can deliver him up to the authority and jurisdiction of the governor. So they don't have the right to kill him for anything other than blasphemy. So what they're hoping to do is use the political game of Jewish leadership working in league with Roman leadership to bring about his crucifixion. And that's a foreshadowing of exactly what's coming in the rest of Luke's gospel. They want to deliver him up to the authority and jurisdiction of Pilate. And they'll put enough political pressure on Pilate that Pilate will give the order for Jesus' murder. And make no mistake, that's what we're talking about. They may have only, in the parable, beaten up the prophets, right? The servants. But they murder the Son. In fact, if we really want to understand this parable and honor the moment in which and the power with which Jesus gave this parable to us, then we should not call this parable the parable of the wicked tenants. We should call it the parable of the murdered son. Because that's what we're talking about. We're talking about the parable of the murdered son, the beloved son of the vine owner. The vineyard owner sends his son, and the wicked tenants, and they are wicked, they kill him. But it's also God's plan of redemption. And so one of the amazing things for us as we see this passage is that he is the beloved son. That's who Jesus is. He's the rock of our salvation. The builders may have rejected him, but he's not ultimately going to be rejected, is he? He's the rock of our salvation. And he will also be the crushing weight of judgment if you do not believe in him. John says, in the Apostle John, one of the men who heard these words spoken by Jesus in the temple courts, says in the 3rd chapter of his gospel that anyone who does not believe in Jesus stands condemned already, because he has not believed in God's one and only Son. Jesus is our salvation, or he's the reason that we will be crushed under the weight of God's judgment, because we cannot do what he has done. Live a righteous life. Die a vicarious atoning death. Do you believe in Jesus? Do you believe that his scars are the payment for your sin? Do you trust Jesus to bear the weight of God's wrath in your place? Do you need his mercy? Do you trust in his grace alone to save? Look to the person and work of Jesus Christ and live. Have I given you enough to sing about? Let's sing.